Welcome to the Strong Youth Project, where our mission is to improve organized sport experiences for youth, parents, coaches, and other mentors via education and evidence-based practice.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Awesome. Yes, so I am so excited to be invited to speak today about sleep and especially how it intersects with youth sports and physical activity and overall health in the youth that we work with. I will lead with the ultimate irony, which is I just returned from an international conference, and so I am very sleep deprived and jet lagged. And so we're going to take all of this with a grain of salt that I am going to hopefully be practicing what I preach today. Okay, so my hope today is that we're going to cover a few things. We're going to really start broad, and we're going to start talking about sleep in youth broadly. And then we're going to nail down what happens when teens, children don't get enough sleep. And then we're going to end with that connection to youth sport performance and how, if by optimizing sleep, can we enhance every facet of youth's overall well-being, but especially as it relates to sports performance. But I want to we're going to start with the discussing of how much sleep do kids actually need. So we're going to do something a little interactive. We're going to break out of our shells. I'm going to say an age, and you're going to tell me how much sleep you think a child of that age would need. And you can just shout it out. You don't have to raise your hand. How much sleep do we think a 17-year-old would need? 8 hours. Okay, 8. I heard some 9s. Okay, what about a 12-year-old? 9. I heard a 10. 15-year-old? I heard one person say 11. What about a 6-year-old? 10, 11, 12, so much. Yes. So, I know. And this is, I think, does a nice job of illustrating even sometimes the most basic of how much sleep do our youth really need. It's a hard question to answer, and often we don't know what the answer is. And there's a number of reasons for this. So the National Sleep Foundation created what they coined as the adequate or recommended amount of sleep. And what you'll notice here, I want you to pay attention to the dark blue. I hate the light blue. We're going to talk about the dark blue specifically, but I want you to notice a few things. So one, the amount of sleep that kids need over time does decrease. So we know that younger children need more sleep, and the range of the quote-unquote recommended amount of sleep also is wider in earlier development, and it starts to narrow as we age. And so if we're thinking about school-age kids specifically, so from the ages of 6 to about 13 years, we're saying the recommended range is about 9 to 11 hours. In teen years, it's shifting down just slightly to 8 to 10. The reason I don't like the light blue is I think the majority of individuals say, oh, look, for, let's say, young adults or adults, they say 6 may be appropriate. That's me. I do just fine on 6 hours of sleep. We know the vast majority of people don't live in the light blue. Most of us need more sleep than we probably are getting or that we think that we need. Now, it's interesting. One of my favorite studies is they took a group of teens and they stuck them in a room that they controlled the lighting, they controlled what they ate, and they just said, you sleep when you want to sleep. And they tracked over time. They didn't look at even the first weeks of data because they said, we know most of you are sleep deprived, you're going to have rebound sleep. So then they looked at the second week of data. And what they found was that teens, in the absence of responsibilities or obligations, were sleeping about 9.5 hours, which tells us that teens likely need more sleep than they're getting. School-age children likely need more sleep than what they're getting. And when we think about athletics specifically, individuals who participate in sports and are athletes often need more sleep, half an hour to an hour more sleep on top of this. So if you're like me and you're thinking, okay, I have a teen who you're telling me should maybe be getting around 9.5 hours of sleep, and they're athletic, so you're telling me 10 hours, and they have to wake up at 6:15 for school, they need to be going to bed by 8:15. Like, you quickly start to see why we are dealing with an epidemic of sleep deprivation. And when we look at what percentage of youth are receiving inadequate sleep, about 60% of middle schoolers meet criteria for chronic sleep deprivation, 72% of teens, and then 33% of adults are not getting adequate sleep, particularly during the school week. And so there are so many factors that can cause sleep deprivation, but one of my favorite figures of all time that was developed by Stephanie Crowley, who's an adolescent sleep researcher, this is called the perfect storm model. We talk about late childhood, early adolescence as the perfect storm of conditions to make it that they are more likely to have short and poor timed sleep. And so I think we can all resonate very quickly with the psychosocial pressure that our youth face today. We know that as children age, they naturally get more autonomy, and we want to encourage that. But with autonomy sometimes means we don't make the best time management choices, and so we might be choosing to stay up later. We are at an unprecedented level in history of the demands that are placed in children in terms of academic demands, extracurricular demands. And so these things eat up time. We live in a 24-hour day, and when we add more things to that 24-hour plate, we naturally have to pull from somewhere, and sleep is almost always the place that gets pulled. We also know that screen time, social networking, this need to connect even after bedtime continues to keep teens up. But the thing that people know less about are some of the changes that are happening intrinsically in children and teens, where there's two processes that really help our body know when it's time to sleep. One of them is what we call sleep pressure. So from the moment our eyes open, pressure is building throughout the day, and it has to be at a certain threshold in order for us to be able to fall asleep. We've all done this where we accidentally take a nap way too late in the evening, and then bedtime comes, our pressure lowered from the nap, and we can't go to sleep. So sleep pressure is one process. And the other process is that internal clock that tells our body when's it time to be awake and when's it time to be asleep. Having been so jet lagged and waking up this morning at 3 a.m. thinking that it was morning, I'm living this right now. So these two things have to be in sync. And teen sleep pressure, school-age children and teen sleep pressure builds slower during the day. And after puberty, the majority of teens' internal clock shifts 1 to 2 hours later. I am sure that many of us have interacted with the teen when we say, okay, you need to go to bed so you get a good night's sleep. They're like, I just can't. I don't feel tired. Or you'll find that they stay up late. And sometimes I think we really attribute this to psychological factors of like motivation or drive or laziness. And in reality, it is really this disruption, this circadian disruption that's driving this. They are not feeling sleepy. It would just be like asking adults to say, let's all go to bed tonight at 7 p.m. We simply would struggle so much with that early bedtime. So we have all these factors that make teens and school-age kids want to go to bed late and wake up late. And then we've got societal pressures, namely school start times being so early morning seminary, early sports practices that cause teens to get up before their body is physiologically ready. And we're dealing with that perfect storm of short and ill-timed sleep. And there's a million other factors that we could also look at beyond the individual adolescent. Like, how do the parents value sleep? What are the routines around sleep in the home? Do we have set times that we're turning in phones? Do we have set bedtimes? Going even beyond, like, how much screen space does the teen have? We're living in a world where temperatures are rising, which makes sleep worse. There are so many factors that are at play that can influence sleep. And we sometimes make choices that don't promote sleep. Everybody in this room has. We might make poor sleep hygiene choices or lifestyle choices. We might have a number of obligations. Sometimes the teens that I work with do have diagnosable sleep disorders, and that can make it really tricky. And then, of course, we're dealing with, again, unprecedented levels of mental health disorders that we also know. The majority of, more than half of mental health disorders have either a diagnosis of having sleep problems or an associated feature with having sleep problems. So when teens have mental health disorders, often sleep is worsened. So let's talk about sleep hygiene specifically, because how many, by raise of hand, have you heard this term, like sleep hygiene, or you just got to do these core things and your sleep will get better? Okay, most of us. So I put on the board what I think are probably the top 10 sleep hygiene recommendations. We're going to do a little game. I'm going to go through them, and I want you on your fingers, as I go through one, just tally how many of these at this moment are you doing, okay? Because I want us to all realize that all of us are probably falling short in some of these areas. So number one, we go to bed and wake up at the same time every day, even on the weekends. Give and take about an hour. We don't sleep in on the weekends. We wake up right around the same time. Okay. We don't nap after 3 p.m. We don't drink caffeine, especially within 6 hours of bedtime. That includes our Dr. Pepper, our soda. We exercise regularly, but we don't do it within about an hour of sleep. We avoid electronics after bedtime. This slide used to say avoid electronics within 2 hours of bed. At the conference that I just attended, they did a ton of research looking at whether or not that's actually a good recommendation. And what they found is the number one predictor of poor quality sleep isn't how much screen engagement you have in children and adolescents, how much screens they use before bed, but it's once it's bedtime, how much screen use that they're having. And so I've decided as a clinician to focus more on screen use after bedtime versus before, because if you have teens or you know teens, this is a really big sticking point. Most teens don't want to do it. Okay, we're also going to avoid heavy meals right before bed or snacking after bedtime. We're going to keep a comfy sleep environment. We want it cool, between 64 and 68 degrees, dark, not a single little bit of light, and quiet. We want a regular bedtime routine. We do the same steps every single night to get ready for bed. We don't just collapse into bed at the end of the day. We have a bedtime that works for your age, meaning we're not trying to get in bed before our body's ready. And we only use the bed for sleep. We don't watch shows in bed. We don't do homework in bed. We don't text or watch or engage in any activities in bed except for sleep. Okay, if you are a 9 or 10, you do 9 or 10 of these consistently, raise your hand. Oh, we have one. That's so rare. Go. If you are a 5 to 8, you do 5 to 8 of these. Good. Oh, okay, awesome. 3 to 4 of these, raise your hand. 1 to 2 of these, raise your hand. Yes, perfect. If I was to have mapped that out, we would have a perfect bell curve, which shows that there's so much variability around how we do these and what, if we do these well. And we're going to come back to sleep hygiene as to answer that question, is this really where we should be focusing all of our energy? So let's start to ask the question, okay, if I'm not getting good sleep, either as an adult or I'm working with youth who aren't getting good sleep, what might be some consequences? One of my favorite quotes by Matthew Walker, and if you're in the sleep world, you know Matthew Walker's name, and even if you aren't in the sleep world, you probably know his name. He's a big sleep researcher, very popular, but he has this quote, which is that human beings are the only species that will deliberately deprive themselves of sleep for no apparent gain. We've all been there at the end of a long day, and we're faced with, I could go to bed now and get a good night's sleep, or I could watch another episode, and we choose that episode. And some might argue there's a gain to that, but we often sleep deprive ourselves and we're losing something in that equation. So let's start with cognitive and emotional impairment. We know that youth who get short sleep have cognitive impairments, especially at school. It takes them longer to solve problems. Their ability to attend to teachers goes down. Their memory worsens. They make more risky behavior or decisions, especially around drug use and driving. They have decreased inhibitory control, meaning you put a cheeseburger and fries and a donut in front of them and they're going to say, I want that. Even if in their mind they're saying, oh, I might have this goal that I'm trying to eat healthier for some reason, they're more likely to lack that inhibitory control. And they just have low energy. And then we have mood changes. We find that teens who get short sleep have increased rates of anxiety, depression, suicidality. They're more likely to be irritable. Again, that lack of energy. And just generally when you ask them, how's your life? They say, it's not so great. So sleep, and we know this both from when we just ask teens about their experience of sleep and how these things are the outcome of getting poor sleep in their lived reality. But part of what I do as a sleep researcher is I deliberately sleep deprive teens, and then I look at what happens in their emotional, cognitive abilities after sleep deprivation compared to when they get good, well-rested sleep. And these trends just come up again and again, that sleep really seems so central for cognitive and emotional functioning. Where most of my research lives is in physical impairment, so what happens in terms of our health outcomes when we get poor sleep, especially youth. And we find things like obesity risk goes up, diabetes, cardiometabolic disease. We're more likely to catch a cold. This one's really interesting. We have a greater pain perception. I think we can think about that application from like a sports perspective. That we're going to be more sensitive to demands on our body when we're getting poor sleep. We're going to have increased risk for mortality and death, and more likely to be unhealthy, making poor dietary choices and being sedentary throughout the day. Oh, at this point, I feel like it's such a discouraging point in my talk because it does feel like there are so many things that can be impacted by poor sleep, but there is room for growth and there's room for improvement. But before we get there, I want to pivot to talking specifically about sports. And I've been working this year with a number of different faculty, and I've really just started to get into sports performance and the intersection of sleep and sports performance in this year, working with the BYU football team. And the term that we often use is that sleep is the legal performance-enhancing drug. Like, we think that this is this underutilized performance-enhancing tool that children, youth, adults can be using to really enhance their game. When we think about injury prevention, we know that children and adolescents who are getting less than 8 hours of sleep often have a greater risk for getting injured on the field or in their sport of choice. And we've talked a little bit about this, but one thing that I want to note is that we also know that individuals, especially athletes who get more sleep, have better executive control. Those are those cognitive processes that help us plan and make decisions, especially in time-sensitive situations like in a game. Reaction time improves, physical performance metric improve, our moods improve, and our risk-taking decreases. And so when we've looked at this in college athletes specifically, we find that sleep extension often results in things like they can run faster, they have their reaction time skyrockets, and they just note that their general cognition, their ability to make choices in the moment, they feel like that gets better. But one of my favorite studies that we can geek out about was they took the Stanford men's basketball team, and I thought this was crazy. They told these adults, you need to sleep 10 hours a night for the next 2 weeks. You have to try to get at least 10 hours of sleep. And they did a really good job. They slept about almost 2 hours more than they were at baseline. But then what they measured was their performance after they engaged in getting an increased amount of sleep. And what they found is that their free throw shooting accuracy went up from 79% to 88%. Their three-point shooting accuracy went up from 68% to 77%. Their improvement in mood, physical well-being, sprint time, reaction time went up. And they just reported, they said, I don't feel tired and I don't feel as stressed. Now, what's fun is one of the studies that I'm currently doing, it's an adolescent sleep intervention study specifically for night owls, those teens who want to go to bed late and wake up late. And we're trying to make them more like morning larks. We do this over the course of 6 weeks, and there's this big motivational interviewing component, because it's not enough just to tell teens, you got to sleep better. We have to really have them elicit, what is it that makes them want to get more sleep? And we've had a subset who are athletes. And when we talk about this study, it is like the lights click in their eyes, and they're saying, you're telling me that if I get more sleep, my game, that could elevate me from to the varsity team. And we're like, yeah, that could lead to that outcome. And that's the hook for them, to help them engage in getting more sleep, because they tie so much of their identity into their sports performance. And so we often use that as a motivational tool to encourage them to get more sleep. So at this point, we'll shift to the final question, which I think is really at the forefront of all of our minds, whether we are youth or we're working with youth, and that's, how the heck do we improve it? Like, they are in that perfect storm. Is it hopeless? Are there things that we can do? And sometimes this question is a little bit overwhelming, because there are so many factors that can influence sleep that sometimes it can feel hard to know where to start. And I'm going to toggle to the next slide, and you're going to immediately be like, why would she ever put this slide on? I can't read a single word. And the reason I put this up here is this is from one of our pediatric sleep medicine textbook. And every single one of the bottom ones is a different sleep problem. And you can just see that there's so many factors that as clinicians we're considering to help figure out, okay, what is it that's contributing to the problem? What's the diagnosis? It's messy. And so there are great places to start and great places to say, okay, I now know that I need to seek additional help to improve this teen's sleep. So we're going to come back to these sleep hygiene practices that we all raised our hand on. I like to think about, and I'll come back, that sleep hygiene is the foundation, but sometimes it's not the finished house. If you've got a teen that you're working with who has sleep problems, let's say they take hours to fall asleep each night, they could be perfect on this and may still have sleep problems. But for some teens, the reason they're getting poor sleep is just because of sleep hygiene. So I say, as a coach or as somebody who works with teens, if I wanted to know where do I start, I would do an assessment with my teen, and I would go through this list just like you did and say, okay, what are the areas we're doing well, and what are the areas we need a little improvement in? Let's say the teen's like, yeah, I go to bed and I kind of like spend a little time on my phone because it helps me unwind, and I actually think it helps me sleep better. This is the narrative I hear all the time. And even when I present data, they're like, that might be, but for me, like, it really helps me decompress, right? So we might say, okay, anything that's approximating what we want to see, every step in the right direction is an improvement. So if it's, all right, let's be on our phone right up until this specific bedtime, and then we turn it off, maybe we listen to a podcast as we fall asleep, that's a win, right? Maybe it's, well, coach, you have me come at 5:30 a.m. for practice, and I can't go to bed at 7:30 every night, and so yeah, on the weekends I'm going to sleep in. I'm going to sleep in till like noon or 1 to try to catch up on sleep. Spoiler alert, catch up sleep is not a thing. We don't catch up on sleep. We can say, okay, what's maybe a way that we can get you to bed 30 minutes earlier? Knowing sometimes we don't have control about when practices are, what's a way that we can try to slowly advance your sleep 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes to help decrease that sleep debt that you're accumulating throughout the week, that then can help you be able to wake up earlier on the weekend to really help with that regularity. So this is often where I will start with teens. But then when we start to solidify these, if sleep problems persist, my red flags that I look for are, is it taking them hours to fall asleep at night? Are they waking in the night and being unable to return to sleep? And are they waking early in the morning even though they're feeling tired? That paired with excessive daytime fatigue, those are kind of the red flags that I'm looking for. And if you solidify these and they persist, that's often a good indication that reaching out to a primary care provider who can refer you to somebody like myself who's a pediatric sleep psychologist or other specialists in the field to help nail down some of these sleep-specific concerns. But I want to really spend, I think I'm going to give us maybe even more than 15 minutes because I think sleep is such an individualized process. If we think back to that first slide, there's so much variability in how much sleep we need. There's so much variability in this room about how we all relate to sleep and what we do to promote sleep and maybe the choices we make that aren't so conducive to sleep. And so I want to give us a chance to really open it up to the group to say, what questions do you have about sleep in general, sleep and sports performance, or how we can optimize sleep? Because I know it is such an individual process. So I'll go ahead and open it up to Q&A at this point. Yes.
So when it says the regular bedtime routine that it's calling, well, yes, phone is off and away, and you talk about only using your bed for sleep. That bedtime routine includes certain hobbies like crocheting or whatever in the bed without really
Yes. This is such a great question. So the question was, should the bedtime routine, we talked earlier how we should only use the bed for sleep, but does that include the bedtime routine? Can we do calming things in the bed leading up to sleep? If possible, the answer would be no. We would really want the bed to only be for sleep. Let me show you why really quick. I'm going to toggle forward just for a second. I threw a bunch of slides in here, but one thing I like to do with teens to really hit this point home is I'll have them write down everything that they do in their bed. So this teen said, yeah, I sleep, but I also YouTube, and I try to fall asleep for a couple hours. I'm super frustrated. I do homework, I do music. If we're thinking about your example, maybe I crochet for 30 minutes in bed to help me feel tired, right? And I think about it like spin the wheel. If I was to spin the wheel, what's the likelihood that arrow is going to land on sleep? And they're like, 40%. And I say, what if we said all we're going to do is sleep, and we're only going to spend, there's always going to be a little bit of us trying to sleep, and we can't really take that out. What's the likelihood if we spin the wheel now? And so sometimes we'll come to this when it comes to bedtime routines because teens love their beds and they want to do things in bed. And so if I have a teen who's willing, I would say we're going to crochet outside of the bed. Maybe we'll get comfy blankets and pillows and put it right next to the bed. We'll crochet there as part of our bedtime routine. And then when we get into bed, we're basically signaling to the brain, oh, I'm getting into bed, sleep is coming, because that's the only thing that I do in bed. Now, I work with a number of teens who have live in less safe environments, or they have space limitations where they're like, I literally can't do anything. Like, my bed is my place. And so we can get creative. We're like, okay, we are not going to be under the covers in bed. We might be sitting on the bed in the opposite direction, and we only get under the covers and lay down when it's time to sleep. So we can really start to train that brain to associate laying down under the covers in bed means sleep. So if we can have them do the bedtime routine outside of the bed, that's always preferred. Okay. And other questions? I saw hands over here. Yes. Oh, yeah, great. Yes. So if we think about screens, there's a couple mechanisms that make it tricky for sleep. So one is light. And when we think about a Kindle, especially like a Paperwhite, where you can really control the light that's being emitted from the screen, it's going to impact sleep less. But the second element is engagement. And it's interesting. Originally, we thought it was all about light. Like, all the research is like, oh, it's suppressing your melatonin, and that's why we shouldn't use screens before bed. And then we started to realize, okay, it's actually less about that and more about, I'm reading a really fun book, and I just want to finish the chapter. Oh, I'm in the middle of this enemies to lovers trope, and they're about to, connect, whatever it might be, and we read that next chapter. Or I'm online, and I'm watching this thing, or I'm texting with my friends, and I don't want to be left out of this group chat after bed, right? It's that engagement element. And so I think if you have a teen who wants to read as part of their bedtime routine, saying, okay, we're going to have a set limit to it, or saying if we wake up, if we're laying in bed and we can't fall asleep and we want to do something that makes us feel tired, we get out of bed, let's pick a book we've read before so we don't feel that pressure to keep reading or to finish the chapter when we start feeling sleepy to get back into bed. So I would think about both of those things, light and engagement, when it comes to screens around bedtime. Great question. Yes?
When you feel like stressed or anxious and you can't sleep, like really can't, is it best to just rest, or do you get up and...
Yes. This is such a great question, which was, if I'm laying in bed and I am stressed and I just cannot turn off my mind, and I'm laying there like this person, feeling more alert at this moment than I was at any point during the day, what do I do? Do I say, oh, it's okay, I'm just going to lay here and at least rest my body? Or do I get out of bed? Generally, especially if you're noticing this pattern again and again, something like this for this person who's spending hours in bed trying to fall asleep, feeling frustrated that they can't, the best thing that you can do is when you notice you're feeling frustrated that you can't sleep, you get out of bed and do something calming until you feel sleepy, and then you try again. Because ultimately, what we want to do is really limit the amount of time we're laying in bed trying to sleep, because it can lead to this condition which we often called conditioned hyperarousal, where our brain begins to anticipate, oh yeah, when I'm in bed, that's my time for thinking. That's my time for stressing. That's my time to go over my anxious to-do list, 6 different times. And we don't want that. We want the brain to associate bed with sleep.
If you are able to quietly rest, is that okay?
That's a really good question. And I think if it was periodic, I wouldn't be too worried about it. But if it was perpetual and you're saying, oh yeah, I'm spending 2 to 3 hours quietly resting and I'm not frustrated, I'm not anxious, I'm just laying there. If it became chronic, then I would start to encourage what we call stimulus control, which is getting out of bed if you're not able to fall asleep. But if it's, one night a week, and there's some times where it just takes you 1 or 2 hours just to let that mind drift off, and it doesn't frustrate you, and it doesn't feel like it's inherently a problem, I think you're fine. And I think this is a great question too, because I would say getting out of bed when you're tired but you can't sleep is probably one of the hardest recommendations for my sleep patients to do, especially teens. And so sometimes figuring out what's that cut point where we're like, yeah, this is the time we're going to say we have to get out of bed, do a factory reset, and try again in a little bit when we're feeling sleepy. Great question. Yes? Oh, great question. And this is something new that I learned in the last few months. Yes, naps can be really helpful at giving you a little boost in energy and decreasing fatigue and sleepiness if you time them right. So we want them before about 2 to 3 p.m., depending if you're a night owl or a morning lark, that can change a little bit. But for athletes specifically, they've done studies that look at the efficacy of a brief 20-minute nap in the middle of the day, and they actually find that it really enhances a number of different outcomes, but including physical performance, mental health, and it doesn't seem to impact their nightly sleep. You just want to be so mindful that you've got lots of ways to make sure you're getting up after that 20-minute. If we're engaging in a really long nap, especially if it's later in the afternoon, then we really start to disrupt sleep later in the night. Great question.
So you're saying that if it's longer than 20 minutes, it's not that beneficial?
Yeah, it's the question is like, what's the ideal time for naps? It's tricky. So an average sleep cycle takes about 90 minutes to get through. So if you're going to take a nap, it's generally recommended you take it early, and it's either 20 minutes, which keeps you in the light stages of sleep, which is still enough to like get a little rest, wake up, and have a boost in your energy. And then, or you're going to do a 90-minute nap. You got to get through that full sleep cycle, because the problem is if you wake up at 45 or 50 minutes, you're going to be in the deepest stages of sleep, and you're actually going to feel more tired and more fatigued than you were at the start before you napped. So you will either want it to be 20 minutes or about an hour and a half. If it's an hour and a half, I would encourage you to do it earlier in the day. So that way it's not going to mess with your sleep pressure at nighttime. Yes?
You said there was a difference between like night owls. What is the latest you should take a nap if you are a night owl?
Yes. So the question is, what's the latest you should take a nap if you're a night owl? And we might take a step back and be like, what's a night owl versus what's a morning lark? A morning lark is somebody who likes to go to bed early and wake up early. So maybe going to bed at 9 or 10, waking up at 5 or 6. That's a morning lark. A night owl is somebody who wants to go to bed pretty late and wake up late. So going to bed at around like 1 or 2 and sleeping until like 9 or 10. Most people are intermediate. We go to bed sometime between like 10 and midnight, wake up between 6 and 8 a.m. If you're a night owl and you're going to bed at midnight, let's say you're going to bed at 1 and waking up at 9 or 10, you could technically take a nap up to 6 hours before your bedtime. So like even up before 5 p.m. would be okay if it was a brief 20-minute nap. So we typically just don't want to have naps be within about a 6-hour window of when your habitual bedtime is. So you can adjust. Some of these recommendations that you saw on the screen were created for morning larks. We live in a society that favors morning larks. But we know if we map out everybody, we have a wide, beautiful variety of the way that people sleep and the way they prefer to sleep. And so some of the work that I do on the side too is advocating for school start times, work schedules that really embrace the variability in the way that we sleep as a society, but especially teens who we know are more likely to be night owls compared to intermediate or morning larks. Yes?
So there are others who are like light sleepers versus heavy sleepers. Does changing like the sleep schedule help with people who are deep sleepers, or what if people need to get more sleep?
Oh, this is a great question. The question is, there's variability also in if you're a light sleeper versus a deep sleeper. In fact, let's do by a show of hands, how many of you consider yourself a light sleeper? You would wake up to a pencil dropping. How many of you would consider yourself deep sleeper? Awesome. We about had a half and half. Women are more likely to classify themselves as light sleepers. They think there's an evolutionary reason to this, to be able to attend to infants' cries. Men are more likely to be deep sleepers so they can have restorative rest so that they can protect the tribe. But in terms of like, is there a way to adjust your sleep schedule to make you light or dark? Not that we know of. The things that you can do to really help enhance like sleep depth, meaning like you're going to the deepest stages of sleep, exercise is actually a fantastic one. So getting regular exercise, specifically strength training and then periodic cardio, is a really great way of getting yourself to stay in some of those deeper stages of sleep versus spending more time in light sleep. Other questions?
So you say that you've done a little bit of work to try to get school start times changed. That's something that I want to happen.
I know.
Can you tell us what you are?
Yeah, I think, I know. Let's unite together. I know, and it's an encouraging, and I'm encouraged if we look across the nation, there has been, I think, the evidence for later start times and shorter academic days in general has just continued to mount. And there are certain states where it's now mandated that school start times can't be before 8:30 or 9 a.m. And they're finding really positive outcomes in terms of academic performance, physical performance. But in terms of advocacy, it's really, I take the research that I get and I go to school boards and I say, look, here's more research, and I'll collate what's been done and say, here's what we're finding, and what would it be like to even shift 15 minutes later, 30 minutes later. And it's so hard because it would be easy if schools were operating in isolation, but we're dealing with school schedules, parent work schedules, sports practice times. I can't tell you how many times school start times we have the win and they shift later, and then sports teams say, okay, that's fine, we'll just move our sports practice to early morning. And we're like, no, we're back to the drawing board. So we really have to think about all of these different processes and saying, is there any way that we can even approximate a little bit later, even a 15-minute leap, a 20-minute leap? The research is unanimous in saying if you shift start times later, teens don't just stay up later, they actually get more sleep. And so I think it's something that we can continue for as community members, as researchers, as parents to continue to advocate for our children. Okay, I think I have time for about one more question. Yes? I know, this is so tricky. And what I mean by we don't catch up is that it's very rare, given that the level of sleep deprivation that we get during the week, even sleeping in on the weekend doesn't cash us back to net, so to speak. Like it's very rare to like actually catch up. They've done studies where they'll sleep restrict people and then they look at their performance even during that catch-up period when they're rebounding, they're sleeping more, and they still find that performance metric outcomes or like cognitive outcomes are still worse even after that rebound sleep. It's not the same as getting that habitual good sleep. But there is a benefit. Like we do need sleep. And if your teen, let's say, is only getting 7 hours and there is just no way to work around it because of school start times or sports practice times, saying, okay, I'm going to let you sleep in 2 hours past what you normally do on the weekend, but I'm still going to wake you up early, like let's say at 9 or 10 a.m. so that come Sunday night, you're going to be able to go back to sleep at a time that would promote the most sleep that you can possibly get during the weekend. So that's the biggest issue that we run into sleeping in on the weekends, is that if you do it too much, come Sunday night, we're back to the drawing board. They're staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning, and then they're so tired at school, they're coming home, they're napping, which means they're not tired till 2 or 3 the next night. And so we really want to get ahead of that by saying, okay, we can sleep in on the weekends, but maybe not 2 hours, maybe up to about 2 hours past their normal wake-up time in the school week. That's the other really hard one for teens. And again, anything that approximates that behavior, we rejoice in. So if we went from sleeping in 4 hours past bedtime and now we're to 2.5, that's a huge accomplishment. Okay, I'll take one more. Oh, that's a great question, which is there any truth to the saying that an hour of sleep before midnight is worth 2 hours of sleep after? No, and I only say that because we have so much variability in individual chronotypes. So if you're a night owl who habitually goes to bed at 1 and sleeps till 10, if you sleep in congruent with that internal clock, if you actually sleep those hours, that would be better for you than going to bed at 9 and trying to wake up at 6. That's a phenomenon known as circadian misalignment, and that's associated with a whole slew of negative mental health and physical health outcomes. So for me, where I'm saying if I'm going to focus anything, I'm going to say, what does your body want to do? And we're going to try to get your body to sleep in that timing as much as we can and as much as is feasible during the school year and with all these other obligations. Okay, thank you guys so much. I'll stick around if you have any other questions.